Okay, my name is Robert Bird. I'm professor of Russian literature, Slavic department. I'm chair of the department right now. And I teach essentially Russian literature and Russian film. 20 years ago this summer, I went to the Soviet Union for the first time of many trips of mine to the Soviet Union and to Russia and to Eastern Europe. And I'm simply going to share with you my own memory of 20 years ago and some of my photographs, for the quality of which I apologize. I didn't know that I would be showing them 20 years later. It was, in retrospect, merely the hollow shell of a once fearsome system, but we still felt pangs of trepidation as we passed by train from Finland into the USSR in the middle of June 1989. We had, after all, just watched the events at Tiananmen Square, which seemed to put an end to any premature dreams of an end to the dictatorship in communist countries. Most of us had begun studying Russian amidst the spirit of hopeful liberalization that accompanied Mikhail Gorbachev's accession to power, but there were few illusions remaining about the limits of what was possible in a world defined by stark, brutal opposition between us and them, East and West, communism and capitalism. It all seemed to be summed up in General Jaruzelski's ugly, cynical, tinted glasses. In my teenage rebellion, prior to this, I recall I once bought and wore a red hammer and sickle t-shirt, but only as a provocation, much like Virginio Ferrari's hammer and sickle statue on the campus of the university over here. I had read Marx with great interest, but I had also studied some economics and was left somewhat confused about how to reconcile aspirations for a better world with what seemed to be iron laws of human behavior and motivation. I am still somewhat confused about this. I was familiar with Orwell, Huxley, Kessler, Clockwork Orange, and other books that could easily disabuse one of utopia. But in the bipolar world of the Cold War, any opposition to one's own society tended almost irrepressibly to affirm the dreams, if not the reality, of the other side. No less than 1984, the book 1984, my mood was captured by a 1978 song, 1989, which was sung to the sounds of the kazoo by a punk troubadour of the day. And this song captures the somewhat apocalyptic sense that pervaded our thoughts at that time. In 1989, when the vineyards have run out of wine, the beer won't be all that bad, but the price of it will make you mad. Eastern Europe presented at least an imaginary alternative to what I knew, and in that sense it bore an irresistible link to a dreamable future. What we discovered when we studied the Eastern Bloc was an entire parallel universe, as if out of a science fiction novel. It had its own hierarchies of professions, of material goods. It had its own resorts, and people from all over the Eastern Bloc would vacation in the same spots on the Black Sea or on the Adriatic. It also had its own lingua franca, or rather lingua russa, which almost everyone was supposed to learn to a certain degree. More importantly, perhaps, it had its own myths, many of which were centered on World War II. As soon as we arrived in Leningrad, our Soviet hosts dutifully began to initiate us into these myths. Our first excursion in Leningrad was to the huge cemetery that holds hundreds of thousands of war dead in mass, unnamed graves. We were taken to the Museum of the Revolution, the Museum of the Blockade, the Museum of the City, and many other depositories of official collective memory. What startled us most upon reaching Leningrad was the clear contradiction between these myths and our immediate experiences. It was not only the lines that snaked for up to 100 yards in front of the entrance to shops. The first Soviets we met were shady young men around our Palace of Youth dormitory. who offered us marijuana, much like shady young men in Washington Square Park, or else like KGB provocateurs seeking to get some American kids into trouble. We all met purveyors of black market goods who offered us to exchange our dollars at several times the official rate. As we got to know the place, we saw that for all the mysteriousness of their motivation, these were probably just normal young men trying to get ahead. Already in 1989, one could see that, like these local currencies, the Eastern values had long lost their value compared to those of the West. As in much of the developing world, one would frequently encounter faded, outdated Western calendars with pin-ups or racing cars. A friend of mine collected Western beer cans, brought to him from the hard currency shops by Western guests. On several occasions, I encountered impromptu public gatherings, crowds formed around political debates or musical performances, which still seemed fearful and fragile. My friends were as likely to view it all as KGB provocation as they were to dismiss it out of hand as meaningless chatter. Life, or at least anything worthy of the name, took place indoors. I was lucky enough to have the telephone numbers of friends of previous student travelers, and these young people, many of them students or engaged in creative professions, took me in as one of their own. They showed me a life filled with color, quite distinct from the grey streets. I took to staying out late, returning home amidst the glorious white nights, the sun hovering dangerously at the horizon. It was from these warm, if claustrophobic, domestic spaces that I viewed the events of 1989. In Czechoslovakia, the protests had begun in January and continued throughout the year without police repression. In Poland, Solidarity was suddenly legalized as an opposition force and elected into power with almost unanimous support. In Hungary, the Communist Party seemed intent on turning its country into a democratic and capitalist one. Gradually, the atmosphere of permissiveness was turning into one of active change. I returned to Moscow that September, flying on Yugoslav Airlines via Zagreb and Belgrade, in whose airports I was somewhat bemused to see marks of an alternative socialism, full of abundant beer and pornography, which seemed perhaps more resilient for being all the more cynical. Returning to Moscow, however, disabused me of any illusion of quick change. I ended up living in one of the more depressing areas of Moscow, beyond the car factories.
What year is this, sir?
Pardon? 1989. What year? This is all 1989. Filled with identically drab 12-story buildings. As winter set in the shortages of goods became acute. I was amused one day to see a sign in the empty supermarket advertising, quote, "Our new line of services, do it yourself." As damp autumn turned to frigid winter, and as the USSR lurched towards its own reform, I followed the incredible events taking place throughout Eastern Europe. First, East Germans used their recently expanded ability to travel in Eastern Europe and gathered in the increasingly liberal Hungary, which quickly decided to open its borders to the West. The protests in Czechoslovakia took on a massive nature and brought down the government. All eyes turned to East Germany, where the aging Erich Honecker was pushed aside by the reformist Egon Krenz, a kind of Gorbachev clone who opened the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November, but who proved incapable of stenching the bleeding and was pushed aside himself on the 3rd of December, less than a month later. The close interaction between the 8 socialist countries had been designed for mutual protection, but as they all seemed to fall onto each other, they only accelerated their tumble. Throughout this period, information was quite hard to come by. The Soviet newspapers reported some of the events in Eastern Europe, but only in brief blurbs that lacked context and were highly enigmatic. Luckily, I had a shortwave radio and could follow events on the BBC, but I still puzzled over their obscure presentation in the Soviet press. On the 24th of October, 1989, exactly 20 years ago today, we read in Izvestia, one of the 2 major Soviet newspapers, of the public protests in East Germany following the election of Egon Krenz as the chairman of the State Council and of the National Defense Council. Without actually explaining how East Germans had been flooding to the west through Hungary, the article noted that the government was willing to allow citizens of the DDR to return home. This was on page 7 of the newspaper, which was itself dominated by speeches from the Second Congress of the People's Deputies of the USSR, which on a daily basis was breaking taboos of public discourse within the Soviet Union. As I was researching these articles for this talk today, I remembered distinctly reading one of them, a note from Pravda from the 14th of December, which informed Soviet readers that presidential elections were impending in the Czechoslovak Soviet Socialist Republic. The first candidate was Ladislav Adamec, whose CV included many laudable accomplishments in the ranks of the Communist Party. A second was Česmír Císař, a prominent communist from the Prague Spring who was running now as an independent. A third was Alexander Dubček, nominated, the hero of the Prague Spring, who was nominated by the Slovaks. Almost as an afterthought, the article mentions the playwright Václav Havel, running for Civil Forum, which the article proceeds to portray as a strangely reactionary force which is arguing against popular elections. Now, everyone knew at the time that Havel was the clear favorite and the leader of the popular opposition. This weak attempt at obfuscation, again buried at the end of the newspaper, was merely puzzling. A third and last example. On the 14th of December, Pravda was still writing about Nicolae Ceausescu as the forward-thinking leader of Romania. On the 26th of December, less than 2 weeks later, Pravda showed 2 photographs. And this is the caption to the photographs, which you see in one of the pictures here. On the left is the site of battles between army detachments and the terrorists in the city of Timișoara, and I apologize for the pronunciation if there are any Romanians here. On the right, there are rebels in an armored personnel carrier of one of the detachments that went over to the side of the people. The journalist is obviously confused. Are the army being opposed by terrorists or by the people? By this time, the other newspaper, Izvestia, had already begun calling Ceausescu a dictator and a despot who had been overthrown by a democratic revolution. Evidently, the populist rhetoric of Soviet ideology had ended up tying the leadership's hands and preventing them from opposing outright, what were clearly democratic choices being made throughout Eastern Europe. Their attention became increasingly focused on averting the same outcomes within the USSR. Now, none of this was entirely evident as I left the Soviet Union in May 1990. I traveled by train, in part because Westerners could buy tickets at the same rate as Soviets, which put the cost of the Moscow-London route at about $6. I stopped for a few days in Berlin and caught the final days of the border between West and East Berlin, the last remnants of the wall. I visited the shrine to those who had died crossing the wall and was struck by the last grave, which was dated February 1989. I took the train across the barren no-man's land, past the shell of the Reichstag, and walked to Alexanderplatz, which struck me with its similarity to Moscow. Today, it is increasingly difficult to tell where the wall passed in Berlin. The entire socialist period seems to have disappeared from public view, no less from public minds. The universities are now filled with young people born after the demise of their parents' world. There is inevitably a sadness about this loss. In retrospect, perhaps Gorbachev and his allies had a point when they reacted to the changes in Eastern Europe ambivalently, acknowledging the popular acclaim for them, but viewing this unsentimentally as the victory of the West. The Warsaw Pact dissolved silently, not to give rise to a completely new security system or to, let us have no illusion, to peace, but simply to move the frontier between NATO and Russia further east. Even Havel seemed in the end to become somewhat servile with respect to the West, most notoriously when he supported the invasion of Iraq. The only place this did not occur was in Yugoslavia, where the fall of the bipolar system allowed for the re-emergence of atavistic ethnic conflict. Despite the European Union, Europe is still divided among long-standing fault lines. For one, the formerly Catholic and Protestant countries have had a relatively smooth transition to a market economy and integration into the European Union. But the further east you go and the further into the traditionally Orthodox Christian areas, the more you will find that socialist era elites, most notably the security services, have only gained in power over 20 years. This exuberant carnival of revolutions might have upturned the established hierarchies, but the revolutions have not, to the disappointment of many, abolished hierarchy. In many cases, the old elites quickly adapted to the new rules and reinvented themselves as populist demagogues, crooked businessmen, or, in many cases, both. The persistence of nostalgia for the lost civilization, which has become known as ostalgia, shows how the frenetic pace of social transformation exceeded what many individuals could handle. People miss much that was common in that lost civilization known as developed socialism. One of the things that has been lost most irrevocably is that warm, colourful domestic space of trust, and mutual trust and freedom, the closest perhaps one can get to lived communism. Another is the sense of less of a moral clarity than of a moral seriousness, a sense that there are things worth living for beyond one's immediate comfort. Was this too an illusion? Most palpably, like the world wars for previous generations, the fall of communism integrated our personal lives, if only fleetingly, into what one might call history. The fall of communism was the event in which I personally, and many of my peers, and many of you, found ourselves at the mercy and amidst the grace of history, when we understood that our inscrutably individual interests and desires were actually symptoms of an historical condition, common to many others, but endlessly more massive than any of us could ever imagine. We were powerless to act, even to take decent photographs, and were left to reflect long after that we had been drawn to Eastern Europe as to the funeral of what had previously passed for the future. We have, in many respects, yet to work out a new shape for this future, a new alternative dream. And one wonders what it is like to grow up today without such defined expectations. Thank you for listening to that. Those are my personal reminiscences, as it were, and I hope that they can lead into some discussion or sharing of other reminiscences simply here today.